All right, guys, for our devotional tonight, I wanted to kind of go along with what we talked about on Sunday. Rick asked me to kind of expand a little bit more. As you know, I had a lot to say. Like I said on Sunday, though, I am still very new to this part of it. I don't claim to even kind of know all of the facts or all of the answers or any of that. But what I do know is that, over the last 3 weeks, I have listened, I have researched, I have read, I have watched, I have talked, I have learned a lot. And it just kind of opened my eyes. Like I mentioned before, my heart just has broken over and over again as I've looked deeper into some of the things that are going on and that have been going on for a long time that I just wasn't really aware of. Kind of like cataracts in your eyes. Like it was kind of foggy and I kind of knew something was going on, but now it's like those cataracts are removed and I can see clearer. Something that I kind of knew was going on, but now I know is going on and I can see it and I have the empathy towards it and I'm doing my best to make sure that others understand too that what it is, that it's more than just some rhetoric out there, that these are hurting people, that there is a group of people who hopefully you'll see through some of the things I talk about tonight, and hopefully this isn't the only thing. Hopefully you're going out there and listening to both sides. Like I said, I haven't taken the party line on this. In fact, I've listened to both sides of the argument or who's saying what, and I've listened to my heart and realized what's actually going on. So I hope you guys do the same. What we're going to talk about tonight, or the verse that I'm going to use is Micah 6:8. So leading up to 6:8, and he's basically saying, "All right, God, what do you require of man? Do you want me to bow before you? How about sacrifices? What about my firstborn? I'll offer my firstborn to you." And then it says, "Oh man, just listen. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly before your God." So I'm going to take each of those pieces in this scenario, and I'm going to do them a little bit out of order. So let's first look at walk humbly before the Lord. Here's the deal. Here's what walking humbly looks like in this situation. It looks like saying, guess what? I might be wrong. The things I've kind of thought or I thought I understood, I actually might not understand what all's going on. It's saying, you know what, because of where my chair is seated, my perspective is one thing, but what if I change chairs for a minute? What if I, walk a mile in somebody else's shoes and look at it from the other perspective and see what could possibly be going on there? And then the other thing it's doing is saying, maybe my viewpoint of this great country is actually a little flawed. Maybe it's not as fantastic as I thought, and maybe it's as fantastic as I thought to me, but really, if you look a little bit deeper, there might be something more. And it reminds me a lot of children. As a kid, you think your parents are the best, right? My dad's the strongest, my mom's the prettiest, my mom's the smartest, my dad's the smartest, my dad can beat up your dad. And you're saying all of these things, that's what you think. And then as you grow up, you realize, turns out my parents are kind of crazy, right? Just kidding, but mom and dad. And it also turns out, as you're a parent, you realize my parents didn't know everything. They weren't they didn't have a book for parenting. They in fact know just as little as I know when I'm parenting. So it's kind of a different perspective as you grow up. So instead of saying, maybe our country is just perfect and all that, that you're willing to say, maybe there are there's some things deep there that have been put in place that we need to look at differently, and maybe there needs to be some changes. So the first thing I want to talk about are your implicit biases. And I don't know if you guys have heard it. It's a term that's passed around a lot, especially now, but it's a common term. And it's your unconscious bias or your stereotypes or your attitudes towards a group of people. So I am very much into looking at studies and research and seeing what is it that's going on. Because I, like you, I'm sure, would assume I don't have any biases. I love all people, right? So what's really going on out there? Well, whenever they did surveys, they started asking groups of white people, how much crime do you think is committed by a person of color, specifically a black person? And white people, when they're rating how much of our crime on a regular basis is committed by people of color, they said 40%. 40% are committed by Black people. Well, turns out that number is 29%. So they were 30% off in just their implicit bias of what they assume is going on a day-to-day. So when they looked into this a little bit further, try to figure out, like, why would people think that? Like, what is the reasoning that you would come across with that kind of number? Well, they found out that in the news on a regular basis, the study showed that Black crime suspects are actually presented in more threatening ways than white crime suspects. Okay, so without realizing it, there's these messages going on that Blacks are more dangerous than whites. Okay, and so then also they looked at how people of color were represented on the reality-based TV. So things like America's Most Wanted and Cops, and it turns out that people of color were treated more aggressively by police than were their white counterparts. So again, those things we're watching, we're realizing like, oh, they need to be super rough with them, like they're just that dangerous of a thing. Another thing that I come across a lot actually is people are saying, well, you know, I have problems because, you know, these friends of mine, they're too white, right? I'm quoting, okay, too successful, too well-mannered. They don't talk right, dress right. So their other, you know, the Black community actually rejects them. My answer to that was, so I'm half Mexican, half white, but I don't speak Spanish. And so my first thing is I grieve for that person, because that bothers me that the enemy can use things such as that to just divide us from our own culture, right? But the second thing is what makes white the standard? What does too white mean? Like that white is this level that people should be attaining. And so if they've attained this level of whiteness, then other people, you know, of their community don't like them, but they're, you know, that's because they are successful and that they've done well, because white somehow in our bias is become like this standard of living up to. The same thing is why, you know, there's white and then there's ethnic groups. Well, why is it a whole everything else? There's more actually ethnic groups than white, but white is some standard, and then things are compared to that. So those are some of the things of the implicit biases that we should be thinking about and realizing that we need to actively engage against. And whenever those thoughts come up, to really think about things and be like, is that an accurate thing? Am I actually having biases that I didn't even realize? Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is just really how long how, I guess, more recent it has been since all of this stuff happened. Okay, so let's look at a little timeline, right? So we know that slavery occurred, 1619 to 1865. So there's 245 years in there, 46 years in there of slavery. Everyone agrees that was bad, right? Well, let's just hope. Most everyone agrees that was a bad time. But a lot of people are like, 1865, I mean, that's when you guys were done with slavery, like, get over it, right? Okay, and then 1865 to 1954, and I would even say into the 60s actually, is when we had all of these extra laws. Segregation was happening, right? And everybody does kind of, well, that was true. That was actually a really bad time too. And so things weren't actually, they weren't really free when they got free. And they were still segregated in huge ways. And so we know that the civil rights movement and all of that occurred. But even that, I feel like a lot of people just feel like, well, that was still, that was Martin Luther King. Like that happened so long ago, right? Then let's just say, I'll just kind of point out. So from the time that we finally got some of those laws off the books for segregation, then there's been a bad turn towards incarceration, mass incarceration, predominantly of people of color, which has put them even further behind the eight ball, further back in actually making progress towards freedom and equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we've promised them, that we've promised that they could have in this country. So I want you to look, let me take me, okay? And I want you to do it on your own self. I want you to think about your generations, right? So this is us. This is my family. my family. So I have my great-great-grandfather. His name is James. He was born in 1872. Okay, just 7 years before my great-great-grandpa was born. That's when slavery was abolished, right? That's still, it feels kind of far back. But in his time when he was, and I'm going to look down at my notes just so you know, I get the timeline right. But whenever he was about, 25 years old, that's when a lot of the Jim Crow laws were going and everything was separate but equal. And a lot of, that was they weren't free. Slaves were not free during that time. Everything was against them, even still. They were getting arrested if they didn't have a job. And so if they didn't have a job, they were arrested. They were put in jail. When they were in jail and then they needed to serve time, they could get out of jail. They could go work back in the cotton fields again for their same slave masters who didn't have to pay them hardly anything. So basically, they were still in slavery during that time. So in 1900, my great-grandma was born. Now, I know my great-grandma. I know she passed away, but she actually passed away when I was 18 years old. So my great-grandma, her name was Ora May. She was born in 1900. So during that time, during her life, there were all these laws specifically passed to disenfranchise Black voters. They said, first of all, well, you can only vote if, you own land. Oh, bummer. You've been slaves for so long and we won't let you buy land or have, much money. So you can't vote because you don't have land. And then they said, oh, you have to pass a literacy test. You have to be able to read. Wait, who cares if you haven't had the access to schools or the ability to learn to read? And in fact, it was illegal for you to learn to read, when you were on, but regardless, you have to do that. And then they're like, okay, but like this white brother over here is really poor. He didn't get to go to school either, and he doesn't know how to read, but that's okay. We actually have a little bit of a caveat for that. We've got something that's literally called the grandfather clause. So if his grandfather was able to vote because he was a U.S. citizen, he doesn't actually have to read. He doesn't have to know how to read. He can still vote. There's very specific laws to continue to disenfranchise Black voters. So then, go 20 years later, in 1921, my grandma was born, my grandma Aline. By the time she graduated high school, still only 18% of Blacks who were ages 14 to 17, so in those high school years, were actually going to school at that time. In fact, there were very few Black schools even available for them to attend. And on top of that, the funding was so outrageous. A white student, like the amount of funding a school got for a white student was 800% more than the Black schools got per student there. So the funding was so outrageously different that there was no way that they were even going to be able to stay up with that. And then we take you to 1957. So my dad's pretty young, right? He's just 62 years old. Many of you probably have dads who are older than that, or you're older than that because you're listening to me and you're on here. So when my dad was born in 1957, it was still illegal to have an interracial marriage, right? So it was 10 years later before that was even legal for you to be married to someone who was a different race than white, specifically Black. In fact, he was actually 10 years old when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. So that's not that long ago. My dad's very young, very active. There's no reason to think that this is in some long past time. And the first school was actually desegregated just right before he was born in 1954, but really it didn't actually make it to most of the schools the laws didn't get down to them to actually make sure that they were desegregated until in the 60s and the 70s. Guys, that is not that long ago. That is whatever they want you to think. In fact, if you look at some of the pictures coming out now, they're saying, so these pictures we've seen for years of the Selma March have been in black and white. Well, they were actually taken in color. And there's thinking, and I won't go into whether the controversy, like the conspiracy of that, but the thinking is, when we looked at those pictures and they were in black and white, it kind of seems like it was a long time ago, right? What are they still griping about? That wasn't that long ago. Well, when you see them in color, you realize these are men and women who are fighting for something. And it wasn't that long ago that they were wanting just equality. They wanted to be free. They wanted to actually have the freedom to be equal on a land that they were brought to, and to be able to enjoy this country that, we have made them call home. All right, so the second piece, so that to me is all about humility. Like, what are we willing to say? Like, this is, I need to be humble and look into this a little bit more. The second piece of that scripture says, do justice. Now, that's the part I want to focus on today. The U.S. is home to 5% of the population, but we have 25% of the global amount of prisoners. 25% of the prisoners, even though we only have 5% of the population. There are actually 655 inmates for every 1,000 inmates, 100,000 people. So there's 655 inmates per 100,000 people in our population. And 6 out of 10 people in the U.S. jails, which is nearly 500,000, on any given day are just sitting there awaiting trial. These are just a few statistics that I want you to listen to and realize how justice has not been being served appropriately in our country right now. Blacks are imprisoned right now at a rate of 5 times whites. 5 times whites. That is staggering, that number. Next thing is that both blacks and whites actually use drugs at a similar rate, right? So you take into account that there's a lot more whites than there are blacks, but we're all using drugs. Like, the percentage of the people of whites that are using drugs is the same percentage of blacks that are using drugs. But blacks are imprisoned for drug charges 6 times more than whites. Guys, that's wrong. That's not good. Okay, do you see that? You see how this justice is not there for people of color. Whenever the war on drugs happened, there was a dividing line. So they said, there's a difference now between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. I'm sorry, I'm not a drug expert, but crack cocaine and powder cocaine are still cocaine, right? No, but see, the difference there is slight, right? So a crack cocaine, even though it's the same drug, it's actually cheaper. It's used more by people of color, specifically blacks, and it's less expensive. So then if you get to actual powder cocaine, that is more expensive and used by whites, and they're in upper middle class. So whenever we started this war on drugs, the length of imprisonment was as high for cocaine for 6.5 years, but for crack, it was 10.5 years. That was throughout the 90s, like from 96 to the 2000s. So basically, we were punishing them for having cheap drugs, right? The same drug, basically. And one of the things that on the sermon with T.D. Jakes said, he said, if one side of Chicago, if your son has a drug problem, he has a sickness and he goes to rehab. But on the other side of the tracks, if my son has a drug problem, he goes to prison. Guys, we've got to fix that. The last stat there is that whites actually comprise the majority of drug users and sellers, but only 30% of the state prison population for drug convicts. So only 30%, even though they're more than blacks, they're going to jail less often. So the next piece on justice I'm going to talk about is pretrial detainment. So here's another piece. So when you throw a defendant in jail, okay, you throw their whole life out, right? You arrest them for something, whether they're guilty or innocent, they're in jail, and now they have potential to lose their job. They, can't supply for their family. These are typically, because of all of the other things, are not people who just have a ton of money in the bank or have grandparents or anything like that that can help bail them out. So what do? They, in order to get back to life, they're more likely to plead guilty so that they can get it done and get back out into the real world. Black and brown defendants are more likely to be jailed before trial than white defendants are. And the average bond amount is double for blacks as it is for whites. Again, because of all kinds of other things. There's no old money with blacks because of all of the ways that we disenfranchised them and did not allow them to have homes and houses because of redlining and all of the evil ways that went on to not allow them to own homes and to create wealth. There's no old money going around in black communities. Okay, there's no great uncles who died and left them millions of dollars. That's not happening because it didn't happen that long ago, right? So they don't have generations. So now we're punishing poverty by saying your bail is double what anybody else is who's doing the same thing as you just because of your skin color, guys. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the perception of police. So they studied that whites have limited and favorable criminal justice contact, okay? That means that whites actually have fewer encounters with police officers, right? And if you're white, you'll probably know that to be true unless you're just a horrible driver or you are a criminal yourself. But in general, whites have fewer encounters, and those encounters that we have, that whites have, are actually usually positive encounters. They're different, very different experiences than people of color do. And because of that, whites have a positive view of the institution of criminal justice, or they also use it as a greater reliance for crime control. So one of the things that I've heard more recently about whenever with the defunding of the police and all of that, and in the disbanding of police, is that, white people are all up in arms and say, oh, well, then who are you going to call, right? Yeah, I'd like to see who you're going to call. Guess what? In black communities, they are not calling the police when there is an issue, okay? Because here's what's happening. When they call the police, they may be just as likely to become the suspect in who they called, and by calling the police, as whoever the perpetrator was. You can see multiple times they call the cops, and then the person of color who called the cops is the one who ends up being arrested or even shot for no reason at all. So instead, what's happening is that instead of being innocent until proven guilty, they are guilty until proven innocent. They're assumed to be the perpetrator. And that is if they're alive to even be able to prove their innocence. And this is happening a lot, guys. I mean, these are just recent examples of it happening. So looking at traffic stops, there's been a lot of studies on traffic stops. Blacks are actually 30% more likely to get stopped for simple things like record checks or vehicle defects or basically no reason at all. 30% more likely than whites. And then, so that's just traffic stops. But then there's what's called investigative stops. So those are proactive stops to investigate suspicious drivers. 28% of black men have experienced these investigative stops. Okay, 13% of white men. 28 and 13, more than double are they just getting stopped to get stopped because they look suspicious. Once they're pulled over, here's one. Black men and women are actually twice as likely to get investigative stops for driving either a really low value car or a really high value car. So not the mid-level, it's the high value. So if they have a nice car, they're gonna get stopped because, again, back to implicit biases, they're assumed to not have earned that car, to not be successful not enough, to not have the money to be able to buy a nice car like that. And once they're pulled over, people of color are 3 times as likely to be searched. 3 times as likely to be searched as a white person. But only 3% of those searches actually turn up any evidence. So 97 people of every 100 people who are searched. Search doesn't mean just looking in your car. That means you're up on the hood, they're searching your car, they're pulling out your seats, they're pulling everything out of your car, being fully searched on the side of the road, embarrassed with coworkers or friends in the car, just because you're a person of color, just because you're black, and they search. 97 times that happens, and there was nothing. So one of the things that was said is that traffic safety stops are based on how people drive, and investigatory stops are based on how people look, and the numbers are staggering. So the last thing, and sorry it's taken so long, I'll wrap up quickly, is love kindness. Love kindness. That one's easy, right? This one shouldn't be hard. It should be love your neighbor as yourself. All right, there's a powerful video of a lady speaking before a primarily white audience, and it says, who is willing to switch places with the blacks in America right now? And nobody stands up. She's like, no, I want you to stand up. Who would switch places with them right now? And explains, that you think, you'd be willing to walk in their shoes for a while. And she's like, the reason nobody stood up is because that means you know what's going on and you understand that it's wrong, that you wouldn't want to be in their shoes. So love your neighbor as yourself. Like, how hard is it to just see that what's going on is not right? I feel like right now this is, it's kind of the modern day Matthew 25:36. So they're asking, well, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty, naked, and clothed? And I feel like the Lord's saying, we're saying, well, when did we see you hurting? Well, when did we see you marginalized? When did we see you disenfranchised or treated unequally? Like, Jesus, when did we see you excluded, mistreated, murdered in the streets? And he's saying, look, open your eyes. It's happening. It's happening right around you right now. Look around you, because what's happening to them is as if it's happening to me. Reach out, do something, do your part. Will you stand in the gap? Like, will you end your silence as the white people who are controlling the controlling class of this country? Will you stand there? Will you lament for your brothers and sisters of color? Like, lamenting is passionately grieving. Will you look at it through their eyes and realize that there's something wrong and it's got to be changed for us to move forward as a country? I feel like it's like Aaron and Hur, who were holding up Moses's arms, and Moses got tired, or first Moses holding up his arms, and he got tired, and then Aaron and Hur came beside him and said, we will stand here, we will help hold your arms up. And I feel like for the people of color, for the blacks in our community, that it's time for us to stand beside them and say, you've been fighting this isn't a new fight. I'm understanding they've been fighting this for a long time, but now let's come in and stand beside them, hold up their arms, and help them to get to the next level. Guys, it's too real. And unfortunately, it's all around us. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this particular unjust murder. I'll leave you with this one more. Man of color, he was in the park with some of his friends doing nothing wrong. They weren't doing anything wrong. And I know, look, everybody's, half the people are always like, well, but did he have a criminal past? And I don't know how it has anything to do with the current. They weren't doing anything wrong, but I'll save you some time. This person was very vocal against, the establishment, against the government, and against the things that were going on. He was even involved in some of the looting and destruction. I don't think that they, actually have any evidence that he stole anything, but it is definitely on record that he wrecked some stuff up. Like, he was definitely out there. And just to be honest, he'd broken a few laws, right? But again, at this moment, it's in the evening, it's after dark, he's in the park with his friends, and law enforcement engages him. For no real reason, they engage with him. They end up beating him to within inches of death. And then they hung him where he died. See, do you not think that this man, that he doesn't fully understand the pain that the black community is going through? Do you not think that he laments over the fact that they are being abused for no reason other than the way that they're created? Do you not think that he looks down on them, and it hurts his heart that half of his sons and daughters are getting treated unjustly for nothing that they can even do or change in just their skin color? I hope that grieves you as much as I know that it grieves him, and I hope you can be with me and do something about this. Take the next step to be silent no more.